What's up everyone? In today's video I'll be covering how I made these balustrade end tables. So the first thing I did was to make the bottom frame using a 2x4, and I had previously milled this 2x4 using my planer to get rid of all the round edges. So I cross-cut the 2x4 to length, then I put pocket holes on the inside pieces of the bottom frame using the K4 Craig jig. And before we go any further with the details, if you do like this table and you would like to make this for yourself, the dimensions and the cut list of every piece I used can be found in the description. So after everything was cut to length, I laid the pieces out and I made sure everything was symmetrical using my square, or what once used to be my square. And then I secured the boards together using screws and glue. In case you were wondering who wins in the case of a plastic square versus a concrete floor, the floor definitely wins, but the square can still serve its purpose. After the bottom frame was assembled, I cut some slats to make the bottom shelf using 1x4 inch burring strips. Each board was placed on the bottom frame, equally spaced, and then I secured each piece using brad nails. Next, I took a new 2x4 and cut off 8 squares using my miter saw. Then I made a super fancy sanding jig by clamping down a belt sander to the tabletop. This actually worked really well. Just make sure everything is clamped securely if you use this method. Anyway, I sanded down all the rough edges and all the sharp sides of each square piece that I cut from the 2x4. The legs I'm using for this table are from Osborne Wood Products, and other than these legs being a little too long for this table, these are pretty much ready to go right out of the box. I didn't have to sand these or do any other work to them. So I shortened each leg by cutting a few inches off each side, which would allow me to get the table the exact height that I wanted. Next, I attached the squares to the top and the bottom of each leg piece, and since this is where the aprons will go, it is important to make sure that the top and the bottom squares are symmetrical and lined up with each other. Next, I made the top apron from a 2x4. So first, the 2x4 was cross-cut to length, and then I ripped the 2x4 in half so I would have 4 equal apron pieces. Similarly to the bottom frame pieces, I put pocket holes on all of these new top apron pieces using the Craig K4 pocket hole jig. To give the top apron a little bit better of a stance, I used a 1/2 inch poplar appearance board to recess the frame a little bit. So I repeated this with the remaining pieces to make the other side. Then I put the top aprons in and clamped across the boards and attached them using the pocket holes. Once again, I used the scrap piece of poplar on the sides to ensure that everything was equally spaced. Next, I brought the bottom frame back, placed what I had just made on top of the frame, and then clamped the top frame to the bottom frame and flipped the table over. This allowed me to access the underside of the table, where I used screws to attach the bottom frame to the square pieces on the legs. At this point, make sure the screws actually go either into the legs or into the squares. You don't want the screws to just go into the slats, which wouldn't hold the frame together securely. I wanted the bottom of the table to sit slightly off of the ground, so I cut some feet using 3/4 inch scrap appearance board. I then attached the feet in each corner using glue and brad nails. At this point, the bottom half of the table was finished and it was time to get started on the top. I was able to make the entire top out of one 1x8 board, which I first cut a straight edge on using my track saw. Next, I cut the board into 5 pieces, 4 which would become the tabletop, and 1 which would be ripped in half to make up the breadboards. So the 4 center pieces were ripped to the same width. And then the last piece was ripped to a smaller width to be used as the breadboards. So after laying all the pieces for the tabletop out, I glued the center pieces together. In several of my previous videos, you've seen me use dowels for this step for alignment, but I found out that if you can cut a straight edge on one side, everything lines up well and the dowels aren't 100% necessary. After the glue was dry, I pulled the clamps off and then I flush cut each edge of the tabletop using my track saw. In order to allow for wood movement, I decided to add the breadboards onto the tabletop using a dovetail joint. So I attached 2 edge guides to the router, and then I plunged the router bit down and cut a dovetail channel through one side of the top. You might notice the router bogged down pretty hard on that cut, which seemed to be caused by the wood chips building up as I cut the channel out. I cut the other tabletop out with the vacuum attached to the router, which really helped with the stress that was put on the router during the cut. Next, I put the same dovetail bit in the router table and I cut a groove out using the dovetail bit on each side of the breadboard. Here's a quick look after the first dovetail channel was cut out, and then I flipped the board over and cut the same channel out on the other side. Here's the end result, which is a dovetail tongue, which will slide right down in the dovetail groove I cut earlier. I did have to make several test cuts on the dovetail tongue before it fit perfectly, but eventually I got it to where it fit pretty nicely inside of the tabletop. Once both breadboards were on, I flush cut each end with my track saw. After the ends were cut flush, I sanded the top surface down using my Rotex sander, and then I trimmed the outer edge using a chamfer bit. Then I sanded down any sharp or rough edges of the main frame. I didn't go too crazy here, I just wanted to get rid of all the sharp edges. Next, I got the absolutely genius idea to pin the breadboards down using a brad nail. Of course, the brad nail went all the way through, so I trimmed the brad nail off, decreased the pressure, and then put the other center brad nail pins in. In case you didn't know, you can actually sand a brad nail flush as long as you have enough of it trimmed off to begin with. With everything fully assembled, it was time to stain the table. For a first coat, I used Minwax Classic Gray Wood Stain, which serves as a base coat since I would be staining over this stain with another stain. After using a paintbrush to get into any hard-to-reach cracks or crevices, I then used Minwax Natural Stain, which was just kind of splashed all over the table in no specific order. Rather than the two stains mixing, the natural stain sort of pulls the gray back out of the table and leaves a very rustic or distressed finish. I then repeated this process on the tabletop, and this is all done pretty quickly. The natural stain goes on over top of the gray stain within a couple minutes after applying it. To attach the top, I first used a slot cutter in my router to cut slots that would allow Z-clips to attach the tabletop to the frame. Here are the Z-clips that go into the slots, And these are basically just wedged into the slot that was cut while screwed into the tabletop. This way it allows for wood movement. After the top was secured, I used a satin polyurethane as the clear coat for the table. I only used one coat, but if you'd like a more durable finish, you can definitely use multiple coats with or without sanding in between each coat. Here are some final pictures of the tables after the clear coat was dry. I really enjoyed making this set of tables, and I think they turned out great. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up and leave a comment with your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more.